Imagine this chilling scene. Turn the clock back over 80 years, and the smoke of World War II is still suffocating the skies over Europe. In an era when human aviation was still in its relative infancy, when elite Allied bases were still locked in grueling dogfights flying bulky propeller-driven traditional aircraft, a true monster of the skies was quietly being incubated deep within a hidden underground factory in Nazi Germany. This wasn't just an airplane, it was a sci-fi creation that seemingly leapt half a century through time. Would you believe that the Germans had already built a stealth bomber featuring a tailless, flying wing design equipped with jet propulsion and capable of absorbing radar waves? This is no pulp fiction urban legend, it is a meticulously documented, albeit insane historical reality. This warplane terrified lie referred to by later military historians and aviation enthusiasts. Germany's doomsday black tech is the infamous Horten HO-229 jet fighter bomber. Its top speed in an era when the absolute best propeller planes struggled to break 700 kilometers per hour soared to a terrifying 1,000 kilometers per hour. This was just a technological leap, it was a ruthless crushing of every established aviation convention of its time. Let's rewind to April 14, 1945. By this time, Nazi Germany was crumbling, the Third Reich teetering on the edge of total collapse. The Allied steel juggernaut was surging across the European continent. It was then that a vanguard unit of the U.S. Army's 9th Armored Division, pushing relentlessly through the roar of artillery, stormed into a covert factory in Gotha, Thuringia. When these combat-hardened American G's kicked open the heavy factory doors, the sight that greeted them, under the dim flickering lights, made everyone instantly hold their breath, frozen in place. Sitting before them was not any traditional aircraft with a familiar fuselage and tail, but a bizarre futuristic Leviathan. Some, in a brief moment of panic, even wondered if they had accidentally stumbled into a secret UFO base. Resting on the vast factory floor was a freshly assembled HO-229 V3 prototype. If you carefully trace the silhouette of this aircraft, you'd be shocked to find that it looks exactly like the U.S. Air Force's modern B-2 Spirit stealth bomber transported back to a World War II battlefield. If you painted both with a matte black Knight's stealth coating relying purely on their outlines, even a veteran modern radar operator might, where they were cut from the exact same mold. Keep in mind, the American B-2 bomber didn't officially enter service until 1997, yet this HO-229 was already roaring into the skies in 1940, for that is a technological chasm of more than half a century. Surrounding this completed prototype were enough parts to assemble another 20 aircraft. Recognizing they had stumbled upon an absolute goldmine of impossible technology, the Americans demonstrated peak battlefield opportunistic instinct. They immediately launched a highly classified Operation Seahorse. They packed up this sole surviving V3 prototype, every single design blueprint, the manufacturing molds, and even the top-tier German engineers who built it, shipping off the entire package back to the United States under the cover of darkness like priceless stolen artifacts. So how exactly was a technological anomaly that completely defied its era born within the war-torn, resource-starved borders of Nazi Germany? The origins of this madness trace back to 1943, stemming from a seemingly impossible death KPI issued by the commander of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring. Germany was already showing signs of defeat across multiple fronts. In a desperate, almost hysterical bid to turn the tide, Göring initiated the ultimate 3 by 1,000 bomber project. How insane were these metrics? He demanded that the German aviation industry produce a super bomber capable of carrying 1,000 kilograms of lethal payload, flying at a blistering speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour with a combat radius of 1,000 kilometers. In the 1940s, when aerodynamic theory was still largely unrefined, this was as absurd as asking someone to lift themselves off the earth by pulling their own hair. The legendary German aviation titans of the time, companies like Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf, who had designed countless elite fighters, were driven to despair upon receiving these parameters. Their top designers racked their brains, ultimately concluding that under existing technological constraints, this was simply an impossible mission. However, the world is never short of geniuses who are crazier than the madmen giving the orders. When all the orthodox engineers threw their hands up in defeat, two men stepped forward. They were the Horton brothers Walter and Dreymar, who would later leave an indelible mark on aviation history. Incredibly, these brothers were not classically trained aerospace engineers. Their primary claim to fame was being fanatical glider enthusiasts. But that didn't stop them from possessing a vision that transcended their time. In the wildly unorthodox theoretical framework of the Horton brothers, the fuselage, the tail planes, and even the vertical stabilizer used to maintain yaw control were all entirely redundant dead weight. To them, it was like running a sprint while carrying a heavy cast iron pot on your back. Not only is it useless, but it creates massive, dragoned wastes precious fuel. They believed the only way to solve the hellish 3 by 1,000 riddle was brutally simple: chop off everything that sticks out. The entire aircraft should be reduced to nothing but one massive wing designed purely to generate lift. This is the genesis of the famous flying wing design. Under this extreme aerodynamic philosophy, flight drag is minimized to the absolute limit while lift is maximized. Fueled by this borderline obsessive passion, the brothers turned their attention to materials. You would absolutely never guess that this futuristic warplane, radiating high-tech glory, was constructed primarily out of primitive wood. This wasn't because the Horton brothers had some bizarre affection for carpentry. It was forced upon them by the brutal realities of war. By late World War II, Germany's strategic metal reserves were utterly depleted, almost entirely fed into the production of tanks and U-boats. Unable to secure sufficient aviation-grade aluminum, the brothers were forced to downgrade to a seemingly desperate alternative. The central load-bearing section of the aircraft utilized the welded steel tube frame, but the massive wing structures were assembled from layered plywood. Yet it was precisely this seemingly pathetic makeshift wooden shell that inadvertently birthed a byproduct that would shock the world's stealth capability. This is undeniably one of the most beautiful accidents in aviation history. To fireproof the wouldn't increase its structural integrity, the Horton brothers mixed a unique concoction into the glue binding the plywood layers: charcoal, dust, and sawdust. This sandwich structure, originally meant just for reinforcement, accidentally formed a highly primitive but incredibly effective radar absorbent material. When allied radar electromagnetic waves struck the aircraft, they weren't intensely reflected back like they would be off a metal surface. Instead, they were largely absorbed by this unique wood and carbon matrix. Furthermore, because the pure flying wing design eliminated the highly reflective vertical tail and bulky fuselage, the aircraft's radar cross-section was astonishingly small. This resulted in a terrifying tactical advantage. When this plane approached at breakneck speeds, the Allied radar networks would either be completely blind or only detect it at dangerously close ranges. By the time it appeared on the screens, anti-aircraft guns and interceptors wouldn't have a fraction of a second to react. But any amateur aviation enthusiast looking at this design would immediately raise a fatal question that countless orthodox engineers threw at the Horton brothers: since this plane has no vertical tail whatsoever, how does it actually steer in the sky? If you throw a tailless frisbee, it just spins wildly out of control. The brothers had to solve this massive stability nightmare to achieve directional control on a pure wing. These two geniuses resorted to an act of violent aerodynamic beauty. Instead of relying on complex electromechanical systems, they used pure math and physics to design a bizarre mechanism known as a drag rudder or spoiler. The name sounds deeply technical, but the principle is brutally simple. At the very edges of the aircraft, the wingtips, they installed two panels or long poles that could pop up into the airflow at the pilot's command. Think of a tightrope walker holding a long balancing pole. When the pilot needed to bank lift, he didn't adjust the tail flap. He simply deployed the drag rudder on the left wingtip. Instantly, the air resistance on the left side of the wing would spike dramatically, while the right side maintained minimal drag. Naturally, the aircraft would yaw toward the side with the higher resistance due to the imbalance. This not only perfectly solved the yaw issue caused by the lack of a tail, but it arguably allowed the plane to fly even smoother than traditional fighters burdened by heavy MPNHs. It was like taming the wildest atmospheric turbulence using the most primal laws of leverage. With flight control solved, the next nightmare facing the Horton brothers was an issue that could easily turn the aircraft into a flying fireball engine heat dissipation. You have to remember the HO-229 was no standard prop plane. It was powered by the Jumo 00 for B-turbojets, Nazi Germany's most advanced yet wildly unstable jet engines. These engines were absolute hellfire generators. At full throttle, their exhaust temperatures were off the charts. Making matters worse, to achieve the perfect aerodynamic shape and stealth profile, the brothers buried these fire-breathing turbines deep inside the wings. And as we mentioned earlier, these wings were made of wooden glue. Shoving a high-temperature furnace operating at hundreds of degrees directly into a sealed wooden box full of flammable resins is practically the definition of an airborne bomb. To prevent the plane from immediately roasting itself into a flying bonfire, upon takeoff, the engineers had to design an incredibly complex, masterfully crafted air cooling jacket system around the engine nacelle. Using special heat-resistant materials, they created a very narrow but high-velocity channel of cold air between the engine and the wooden airframe. By channeling the freezing high-speed air rammed into the intakes during flight, they forcibly stripped the terrifying heat away from the engine casing. It was like wrapping a shield of invisible frost around a pillar of fire. The slightest miscalculation meant the plane would disintegrate at 10,000 meters. Somehow dancing on the edge of a razor blade, these mad German engineers actually made it work. In February 1945, history witnessed a breathtaking moment. The HO-229 V2 prototype was finally pushed onto the runway for a test flight. In the cockpits at Erwin Ziller, a seasoned German test pilot. As the jet engines erupted with a deafening roar and this black bat, like beast, surged into the sky, everyone present was utterly floored by its performance. Over the next few test flights, the aircraft was nothing short of a miracle. It easily shattered the speed limits of every propeller plane in existence, genuinely hitting the staggering 1,000 km/h mark in a dive. For context, the premier Allied fighter, the P-51 Mustang, was pushing its absolute limits just to reach the low 700s. If this plane had entered mass production, Allied pilots would have faced a completely one-sided slaughter in the skies. They couldn't catch it, and their radars couldn't see it. However, Nazi Germany's time was up and fate did not grant this doomsday miracle the chance to truly spread its wings in combat. During one critical test flight, disaster struck. While climbing to extreme altitudes, the highly unreliable jet engine technology of the air failed them. The Wright Jumo 00 engine suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure and burst into flames. The black flying wing, previously flying with such elegance, instantly lost its balance. Adding a tragic and desperate layer to the disaster, the HO-229 was designed to fly at an astonishing 16,000 meters. At that altitude, the air is so thin and the pressure so low that human blood would literally boil. To keep the pilot alive, Germany equipped Ziller with an early, incredibly bulky, pressurized high-altitude G-suit, essentially turning him into an inflated Michelin man. As the aircraft caught fire and went into a violent tumbling dive, Ziller desperately tried to pull the ejection seat lever. But trapped by the restrictive pressure suit, fighting high G-forces and sheer panic, he couldn't execute even the simplest escape maneuver. Ultimately, this mad creation, carrying the final hopes of Nazi Germany, slammed into the earth like a fallen black meteor, killing Ziller instantly. This horrific crash, combined with the relentless tidal wave advance of the Allied forces, signed the death warrant for the HO-229 project and buried Germany's final aviation fantasy forever. If the Germans had just 6 more months, if those 20-plus HO-29s sitting on the assembly line had actually taken to the sky, forming a ghost squadron of bombers slipping silently over the English Channel, would the entire trajectory of World War to have been rewritten. It's a chilling what if that still keeps historians up at night. Fortunately, history does not deal in hypotheticals. Following the Operation Seahorse extraction mentioned at the beginning, the sole surviving V-3 prototype was carted away, and this chapter of Nazi black tech ultimately became crucial fertilizer for the American aerospace technology tree. Fashionably, after the aircraft arrived on U.S. soil, it was heavily studied by an American aviation visionary who was equally obsessed with the flying wing concept, Jack Northrop. The founder of the Northrop Corporation laid eyes on this German warplane. It was likely like seeing a long-lost twin. He absorbed a massive amount of inspiration and aerodynamic data from its remnants. Decades later, building upon the flying wing theories inherited and evolved from the ashes of World War II, Northrop Grumman developed the B-2 Spirit, a stealth bomber that commands absolute across the globe today. You could easily argue that the DNA of an 80-year-old would-un-German prototype still pulses through the veins of the modern B-2. To finally put the stealth myth of this World War II black tech to the test in 2008, over 60 years after the plane was conceived, the brilliant engineers at Northrop Grumman and did something incredibly hardcore. Backed by a massive budget, they used state-of-the-art material science and scanning technology to build a flawless 1-to-1 full-scale replica of the HO-29. They hoisted this model up in a highly classified radar testing facility, then bombarded it with the exact electromagnetic frequencies used by Britain's famous chain Hull early warning radar network of World War II. When the test results came back, even the American experts, accustomed to modern high-tech marvels, gasped in disbelief. The date approved it thanks to its unique flying wing, shapen the carbon-laced glue. The HO-29 had in fact accidentally achieved rudimentary radar stealth. Against the British radar grid of the time, its detection range was reduced by a full 20% compared to traditional fighters. What does 20% mean in the split-second life or death environment of aerial warfare? It meant that by the time the British radar finally spotted this high-speed jet monster, the window for London's air defenses to sound the alarms and scramble, interceptors would shrink from a comfortable 19 minutes down to a terrifying 8 minutes. 8 minutes isn't even enough time for defending fighter planes to warm up their engines. When we look back at this history today, staring at the yellowed blueprints and the fragmented wooden wings rotting in the corners of museums, we can't help but feel a sense of awe at the explosive technological leaps born from a mad era. In the absolute depths of resource exhaustion, the Horton brothers used some wooden planks, glue, and steel tubing to Frankenstein together a phantom of the future. It stands as a dazzling spark of human aviation ingenuity, blooming under the ultimate pressure and simultaneously the final impotent swan song of a dark empire that tried to swallow the world. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history, deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe in your strategy observer. I'll see you on the next battlefield.